CSS selectors. Selector is the first thing in a CSS rule. It tells CSS the elements that the styling should be applied to. The first is type selectors. Type selectors applies styling to elements with specific tag names, e.g. h1, p. Here the selector, h1, means the styling applies to h1 elements. In the second rule, the font size styling is applied to all p elements. See the result. Let's correct the typo. Give all h1 element a color of navy. Also give the p elements a color of navy. See the result. You can also apply styling to a list of selectors by separating it with commas. This makes your CSS look cleaner. Here, the color styling is applied to all h1 and p elements. See the result. The next type is the class selectors. It applies styling to elements with a specific CLSDD attribute value. The class selector format is .className. Here the styling applies to h1 elements with a class attribute of heading. See the result. This selector applies to all elements with a class attribute of heading. See the result. The next type of selectors is the ID identifiers selectors. The ID attribute must have a unique value for every element it's present in. Its format should be #idValue. See the result. Let's give the selector a background color. See the result. Let's make the selector match h1 elements with an id of heading. See the result. Don't use the same id value for more than one element, because it will cause future problems when applying JavaScript to the HTML file. See the result. The best method is using class selectors when you want to apply styling across various elements. Reload the browser. Your class can have multiple values separated by whitespaces. This can prove useful when styling your elements. In our example, we added a bottom border to all elements with a class name of heading. Reload your browser to see the effect. Let's remove the rule. See the result. The next is attribute selectors. Attribute selectors apply stylings to elements with specific attributes. The attributes can be anything like class, src, width. To best explain attribute selectors, we'll use the img element. See the result. Resize the height. Reload the browser. For attribute selector, the attribute must be in this format, attribute. Here the styling applies to every IMG element with an src attribute. See the result. Here the selector matches all IMG element with a width attribute. You can make it match all IMG element with a width attribute's value of 200. See the result. This matches all element whose width attribute has a value of 200. See the result. If the attribute selector is in this format, attribute name tilde equals value. It matches any element whose attribute can contain more than one whitespace separated values, and value is exactly one of them. The class attribute can have more than one whitespace separated value. Here our example matches P elements whose class attribute's value list contains heading. See the result. If the attribute selector is in this format, it matches any attribute whose value is preceded by value. Just like our example matches P elements whose class attribute's value starts with ht. See the result. If the attribute selector is in this format, it matches elements whose attribute's value is suffixed by value. See the result. If the attribute selector is in this format, it matches elements whose attributes contains one or more occurrences of value. See the result. If the attribute selector is in this format, it matches elements whose attributes value starts with value followed by a prefix. See the result. Next, let's look at pseudo-selectors. Pseudo-selectors matches elements with specific functionalities. It's divided into pseudo-class and pseudo-selectors. Pseudo-class selectors styles elements in a specific state. Its syntax starts with a colon followed by the pseudo-class name. There are various pseudo-classes like hover, visited. Let's use the element to explain pseudo-classes better. The hover pseudo-class selector can be used to style an element while being hovered with the mouse cursor. It's mostly applied on hyperlinks. The background color changes when the cursor hovers it. Focus pseudo-class styles elements while it's being focused. Try clicking within and outside the box to see the result. This pseudo-class is mostly used by form inputs. Pseudo-element selectors matches part of an element's content. This is its format, double-colon followed by the pseudo-element name. The first line pseudo-element styles the first line of the element's text content. See the result. Let's double the text content so it can span multiple lines. Only the first line is styled. First letter pseudo-element styles the first character if the elements. See the result. The before pseudo-element adds text characters before the text content of the element. It must have a content property for storing the text. See the text content. Let's style the preceding text. See the result. The after pseudo element adds text characters after the element's text content. See the result. Change the styling. See the result. The next is combinators. Combinators are not selectors but are rather symbols that are used to make your selector more specific. The first is the descendants combinators. The descendant combinator is represented by a white space and it's used in this format. Selector A white space selector B, it matches selector that is a descendant of or nested by selector A. In our example body P, the selector matches P elements that are children element of the body element. See the result. Add more styling. See the result. It doesn't have to be a direct descendant, it can go deeper. See the result. The child combinator is used for matching selector B that is a direct descendant of selector A. The styling didn't work because P isn't a direct child of body element. P is a direct child of main element, not body element. See the result. The adjacent sibling combinator matches selector B that immediately follows selector A. In this example, the selector matches P elements that immediately followed AH1 element. The styling won't apply because there's no P elements that immediately follows an H1 element. See the result. Only the main element immediately follows the H1 element. See the result. The general sibling matches selector B that follows selector A not necessarily immediately. See the result. There are three important concepts in CSS: cascade, specificity, and inheritance. The first is cascade. Cascade says that when the same styling are applied on similar selectors with the same weight, the last rule will prevail. Here the background color property is applied on two rules targeting the same selector, H1, of equal weight. Hence the last styling is used. There are two ways you can override cascade. The first is inline CSS. When you use inline CSS, it overrides every other styling. Here the background color of pink will be applied to the H1 element instead. See the result. But don't use inline CSS because it has many side effects. The next way to override cascade is by modifying the specificity. For specificity, the higher the selector's specificity weight, the higher its chances of getting used. You can make a selector have more weight by combining more selector types. Some selectors has higher specificity than others. The formula for finding a selector's weight is like H, T, U 100, tens in unit. H belongs to ID selectors, T to attribute selectors, and U to type selectors. The first rule has a higher weight than the second. Hence its styling is used. Here both rules has the same specificity, so the last rule prevails according to cascade. See the result. The first rule will prevail because it has a higher specificity. H1 is 001 and hash heading is 100, hence H1 hash heading is 101. See the result. The first rule will still prevail because it has a higher weight than the second. See the result. Here the first rule still prevails because its specificity is higher than the second and third. See the result. You can easily get the specificity of a selector in Visual Studio Code by just hovering the selector with your cursor. Type selectors has a specificity of 001. Class and attribute selectors has a specificity of 0, 1, 0. ID selectors has a specificity of 100. You can combine multiple selectors except type selectors to increase its specificity. Here the third rule had a selector with the highest specificity, so its background color is used instead. See the result. The second rule's selector still had a lower specificity 011 than the third 101. See the result. Here the second rule's selector has the highest specificity. See the result. Pseudo element selector had a specificity of 001. Here the third rule's selector had a specificity of 002. Pseudo class has a specificity of 010 like attribute selectors. Here the second rule's selector has a specificity of 011. The next is inheritance. Inheritance is when the styling applied on the parent is passed on its children element. Some properties inherit by default while some don't. Here the font size property specified on the body element will be passed on the children element. See the result. Changes in values are also reflected on the children. See the result. Make more changes. See the result. There are different ways you can control inheritance. You can either specify the value explicitly, e.g. blue, red, yellow. If its value is inherit, it inherits the parent's styling. See the result. A value of initial means it should use its default value. The default value for font color is black. Challenges.